Critical thinking provides us with the skills to analyze and evaluate information so we can gain the greatest amount of knowledge from it. And it provides the best chance of making the correct decision and minimizes damages if a mistake does in fact occur. Utilizing critical thinking skills will help lead us toward being more rational and more disciplined in our thinking. It'll help us reduce our prejudice, and we all have them, and provide us with a better understanding of our environment. In this podcast, I'll provide you with the skills to evaluate, identify, and distinguish between relevant and irrelevant information. And this is based upon a critical thinking course. And so the tone, the way it's presented is going to be less conversational, but a lot of information coming your way to help you understand critical thinking and where you are on the spectrum. Are you really a critical thinker, or are there areas to improve? And if we're really critical thinkers, then there's always an area to improve upon. I produced and presented the podcast last week on computer software assurance, CSA, and what's all the hype about. This is a new methodology when it comes to computer systems validation, and it looks pretty promising to help us alleviate the pain we've experienced in the past with overdoing it or not thinking critically and just doing a lot of effort and creating a lot of documentation, thinking that the amount of documentation is going to prove something, or the amount of testing is going to improve something. But with critical thinking, we should apply that so that we are making sure that we have critically analyzed the situation and we are taking the best steps, the best approach when it comes to validation, and validating the high priority things to the highest degree of rigor and the lower priority things to the appropriate level, whatever that may be. If you haven't had a chance, go back and listen to that podcast, or after this podcast, you can go ahead and take a listen at that one. And subscribe to our podcast. We're on Spreaker and Google Podcasts and SoundCloud. Pretty much any podcast player you have, you can tune into the Quality Culture Podcast. So let's go ahead and get started and dive into critical thinking. And just a really quick recap, in computer software assurance, CSA, the paradigm was flipped around. In the past, with traditional computer systems validation, CSV, documentation got the most attention, then testing, assurance needs, and then critical thinking at the very bottom of the pyramid. Very small, a little bit of critical thinking at the very end. But CSA flips that paradigm around, putting critical thinking at the top. The most important to start off with critical thinking, then assurance needs, testing, documentation. If critical thinking is at the top, the highest priority when it comes to CSA, the new way of performing validation, which really isn't new, it's just a reinforcement of risk-based validation, least burdensome approach, which came out in guidance in 2002 from the FDA. But aside from that, it puts critical thinking at the forefront of our minds so that we are applying critical thinking when it comes to CSA or validation in general. We'll be covering a lot, but the objectives here in this podcast is to help you understand the components, the elements of critical thinking, how to use nonlinear thinking, logical thinking, recognizing what it means to be a critical thinker and evaluating information through critical thinking skills, looking at the benefits of it, and then the ability to revise our perspective when necessary and comprehend problem-solving abilities. When we think of critical thinking, it's akin to the study of logic. It's similar, related to the study of logic. It relates to how we make decisions and use our own judgment. But it's more than just awareness of our own thought processes or metacognition. It's about how we take action. As individuals, our ability to reason well is considered a critical thinking skill. Reasoning well is a critical thinking skill. And many of the definitions of critical thinking tend to focus on a person's ability to reason. Reasoning occurs when we use our knowledge of one thing, process, or statement to determine if another thing, process, or statement is true. Again, reasoning is when we use our knowledge about a thing, a process, or a statement to determine if another thing, process, or statement is true. We apply reasoning. We use logic to determine what follows what. And human reasoning does not always follow logic and is often based upon emotional bias. We see that a lot, especially now. Human reasoning is not always logical and a lot of times emotional. Now, later on, we're going to see how we can use emotion, but not allow that to cloud our judgment. What's important now is to consider open-mindedness. It's a virtue on how we learn. Particularly being open-minded means that we're taking into account relevant evidence or arguments to revise our current understanding. We're not rigid and set in our ways. We're open-minded to consider relevant evidence to change our understanding. It means being critically open to alternatives, willing to think about other possibilities, even after having formed an opinion, and not allowing preconceived notions to constrain or inhibit reflection on our newly presented information. So it's important to be open-minded. And we'll apply analysis. And in the analysis step of critical thinking, it helps us to discriminate and access information. And learning occurs basically in three different domains: cognitive, affective, with an A meaning emotions involved in it, and psychomotor, which is the cognitive and the actions based upon cognitive. But right now in the cognitive domain, that's going to be the focus here, and it involves the process of discriminating or separating. It gives us the ability to break down the complexity of an item or an idea that allows us to gain a better understanding. So in the three different areas that learning occurs will focus on the cognitive aspect of that. Logic and reasoning are similar, but not the same. They're similar, but different. Logic is the branch of philosophy that gives us rules for deriving valid conclusions. And a conclusion is valid if it's derived from factual statements. For example, a logical statement could be 1 + 1 = 2. And this rule is based on fact. 1 + 1 does in fact equal true. It's a factual statement, and these factual statements are called premises. And basically, in other words, when reasoning does not follow the rules, it is not logical. If it doesn't follow the rules, it's illogical. Critical thinking can be approached in a step-by-step fashion, which is linear or vertical, but we can also take a nonlinear approach with critical thinking. Sometimes nonlinear is considered lateral thinking. So we'll dive into that in a little bit of detail right now. So one of the first steps in developing our nonlinear thinking is to step out of our comfort zone. Basically, the concept involves seeing information or circumstances from a different perspective. And a zone is defined as an area set apart in some way. So if we're set in this area, we need to get out of our comfort zone into a different zone to see a different perspective. And in critical thinking and problem solving, we sometimes have to get out of the areas or zones that make us uncomfortable to stretch our thinking. And it's important not to jump to conclusions. An important step in problem solving is taking the time to acquire the necessary information. Often we tend to jump to conclusions. I do all the time. I'm sure you do. We all as human beings jump to conclusions before we have all the facts. But how can we use our understanding of logic to gather all the necessary facts so we don't jump to conclusions? Remember, the premises are the facts or statements that help us to come to conclusions. And expect change. If we're doing all of this critical thinking, look at differences of opinions, linear, nonlinear, applying all of this stuff to become open-minded, expand our thinking, we have to be willing to change. And a common saying, you've probably seen it before, is be the change you wish to see. With so much happening globally, domestically, everywhere, there's change everywhere all of the time. It's in business, it's the standard course for business. The only thing we can expect is change, especially in organization. Nothing stays the same, and sometimes we are the ones initiating change, actually becoming a change agent. It's good to initiate change when appropriate, provided we apply critical thinking to make sure we're making the right changes. But the question today in our culture is not will change occur, but how well will people adapt to the change when it occurs? Now, we can protect ourselves from becoming obsolete by changing. If we're rigid and we don't change, that's dangerous for us. And if you look throughout history, the Luddites were resistors of technologies. They were smashing looms and stuff and printing presses. They didn't like technology. Even buggy whips, there was a fear that the automotive industry is going to put the companies that make buggy whips out of business, horse whips for the horse-drawn carriages, the buggy whips. So basically, they resisted the technology. Well, technology advanced, and we see more and more technology today. So it's important for us to adapt to the change so that we don't become obsolete. In fact, new things coming, advanced technologies, things heading our way are opportunities for us, not to replace us, but to expand us. And this is actually part of nature. Adaptation is a survival skill of nature. And the species which survive in an environment are those species that are most capable of adapting well. Now let's talk about logical thinking. It's a process which involves steps, and basically logical thinking checks the components of an argument and making connections between those components, and this altogether is what we call reasoning. And there are four major steps of logical thinking. They are: number one, asking the right questions; number two, organizing the data; 3, evaluating the information; and 4, drawing conclusions. So let's talk about number one, asking the right questions. The first step in logical thinking should be asking the right questions. It's based upon the components of critical thinking, and the logical thinker should begin reasoning by asking many questions. And an important question to ask is, what are the premises? If we are confused about the premises, we may make a mistake further down the line in the logic process. So that's really a good thing to start out with. And then we should distinguish between whether the statement or a statement is a fact or a value, what should or ought to be the case, and be alert not to confuse the two of them. And let's say that again. We should distinguish between whether the statement, the premises, is a fact or a value, what should or ought to be the case, and be alert not to confuse those two. And finally, we should check to see if any premises or vital information is missing. That's a key point to remember, is that no conclusions can be made without premises. Then we organize the data. Organizing the data is the second step in the logic process. So we know the premises, we can begin to organize the data, and we organize this data and information by making connections. And an effective method of organizing the data includes breaking up the information, diagramming it, laying out the premise, and then figuring out how to illustrate it. Tree diagrams, for an example, are helpful because they can graphically show connections. Schemas, database architects have developed schemas to organize database management systems, which is a way of organizing the data. Well, we could do the same thing. We get a lot of information. We need to figure out how to organize, where to put it, categorize it. So we could start breaking it down to help make sense. And then evaluate the information. Now, this is really important. After organizing the information, a logical thinker can proceed by evaluating it. And evaluating information involves determining whether the information is valid. Conclusions cannot be made until a distinction is made between truth and validity. Let me say that again. Conclusions cannot be made until a distinction is made between truth and validity. People often have trouble separating what is valid from what is true because of ingrained beliefs. And a belief bias occurs when an individual's belief system interferes with their ability to come to a logical conclusion. The belief system on how we were raised, the belief system, religions in general have different belief systems, and those belief systems are ingrained in people. And I'm not saying whether they're valid or not, but that's just a way to communicate and understand that there could be belief bias, where if two different belief systems see things different ways, it's very difficult to change those things, and proving the validity there is nearly impossible. But that is an example of a belief bias. Another example is, I've come out of college, it's my first job, I work for somebody, they teach me the ropes, I'm green in industry, and I learn from my mentor on the way the world really works, how business really operates. And I'm like a sponge. I absorb all of this information, and I hold that to be true, a belief bias that I hold near and dear to me, and that carries forward. And I will use that belief bias to determine if things are valid or not. But I have to be very careful about that, because is it really true, or is that just a belief bias? Is it valid? Now, a confirmation bias is the tendency to use information to support our hypotheses about a problem. And this happens when we're dealing with something that may be true or not. If it's true, it's true. If it's not true, it's false. It's black or white. It's either true or it's not true. But we could fall into the trap of a confirmation bias, meaning I am only going to select the information that supports the truth about whatever the premises that I am operating upon. I'm going to reject all of the information that doesn't support my hypothesis, but I want to accept only the truth about it, and that's confirmation bias. So we have to evaluate information, but be very careful to separate the validity from the truth and know that they're different. And again, evaluating information involves determining whether the information is valid, and we can look at valid information based upon the truth that's supporting that. But if we're thinking of validity, we need to be careful of belief bias. And if we're looking at if things are true or false, we have to be careful of confirmation bias. And then from that, we can draw the conclusion. So once the data has been collected, organized, evaluated, and now we can draw the conclusions. Recall that in deductive reasoning, conclusions are inferred based upon valid premises. In inductive reasoning, we use observations to draw conclusions or a hypothesis. And inferences naturally flow from the evidence. And in making inferences, the logical thinker should be certain and not conclude more or less than what is implied. So basically, you have to be certain about the facts, make sure it's valid, the premise is valid, and not add to or subtract from. Infer only what the data implies. Check to ensure inferences are consistent, and identifying any underlying assumptions that we may have. So what are some of the characteristics of a critical thinker? And do they have are we born, basically? Do we have these innate abilities to be a critical thinker? So let's take a look at some of these. And spoiler alert, we're not born. These are things that we have to learn. So sure, our environment may help us be, the way we're raised may help us to be a critical thinker, or may shut down the ability to think critically based upon the culture or environment that we're raised upon. But we can all learn these skills regardless of where we were born, how we were taught, whatever. This is a practice that we could learn and we can apply and we can perfect. But what are the characteristics of critical thinking? One is active listening, curiosity, self-discipline, humility. So there's 4 of them there: active listening, curiosity, self-discipline, and humility. And what is active listening? Well, we've all heard it before that the best communicators are active listeners. But what does it mean to practice active listening? It means that the listener is completely engaged in what the speaker is communicating and not judging what's being said. The listener is not formulating his or her rebuttal or responses to the speaker, or even worse, thinking about something that is completely unrelated. I have to be careful of that. If I'm listening to somebody, I really have to focus on what that person is saying and not getting little bits of pieces, but preparing my argument or my rebuttal to their response. I am not listening to what they're saying. I'm taking bits and pieces that I can use to support my own argument that I'm going to use once I get a chance to come back on. That is not active listening, and that is not a good communication skill. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, things to work on, and for me, active listening is very important. Critical thinking is very important. In fact, I took there's a test. I can put it in the resources. There's a test you can take every day on critical thinking to find out how you did the previous day or the previous week to where you are on the spectrum. And the funny thing is, I thought I was a critical thinker, which that in and of itself shows that I've got areas of improvement. And I found out that yes, I have critical thinking skills, but there's definitely areas of improvement. And this is an example of one of those areas of active listening. And then being curious. I do have to admit I'm very curious. I love to learn, find out new things, and being curious is great. I cherish that ability, and it's another skill that we can use in developing critical thinking. Some scholars believe that Socrates' ultimate goal was not to advocate his methods, but to advocate self-improvement and to spark curiosity. There are many methods to engage curiosity, but they all basically involve raising a question. For example, Einstein prompted his curiosity by asking questions about how matter and energy functioned, and we all know that E equals mc squared as a result of his curiosity, and that's a gift that we have, and it's free. We could be curious and explore and learn new things. The other thing is to be disciplined. So we could be curious about everything and not accomplish anything, but we need to be disciplined in how we approach things. So reasoning and rationale are often associated with self-discipline. Critical thinking is a self-disciplined, self-guided action. And critical thinking requires us to use our own reasoning skills and have the ability to evaluate and reflect. How did we do in this situation? How did we do today? How did we do yesterday, last week, this month? So these are really important things. We need the ability to evaluate and reflect upon ourselves and be disciplined so that we can learn. One important thing to consider is that people who are critical thinkers are often more empathetic and aware of the world. We're not biased. We're open-minded. We're looking around. We're listening to other people. And this makes us more empathetic and aware of the world and expands our thinking and improves us as well as our viewpoint of the world. And it shows a commitment to self-development and striving to make our world, our environment, a better place. So it's a good thing. But we have to be humble. And this is easy to say and hard to do. And humility is me not thinking I'm better than or less than you. And that is hard. Humility is defined as the quality of being modest of opinion or estimate of one's own importance. It's the complete opposite of arrogance, and humility relates to having an open mind, to be receptive to new information or opinions. And the critical thinker would have to be modest in their own opinion of themselves or their own opinion about their own opinions. And being humble allows us to accept and see information in a way that's not filtered through our ego. Again, are you humble? If you jump and say, yes, I'm humble. I'm the most humble person. I heard a comedian say that I'm so humble I've given seminars about humility all over the world. Well, that's an example of not being humble. We're all human. We all make mistakes. Nobody's better than or worse than anybody else. We're all equal. That's humility. What are some the other characteristics about critical thinking? We'll take a look at 4 additional topics, and one is seeing the big picture, another objectivity, using our emotions. We talked about that earlier, and being self-aware. One of the main functions of thinking is to make connections. So we have an amazing brain, neurotransmitters and synapses and these connections and interconnections. It's just fascinating how the brain works. Much more fascinating than a computer chip, which is binary on or off. Our brain has the ability to make these connections between different things, which is why artificial intelligence is artificial. It's not true intelligence like the human brain, which operates completely different from a computer chip. So one of the main functions of thinking is our ability to make these connections. And our own ideas gain significance when we can relate or connect them to other ideas. We start to gain insight. We've seen similarities between the ideas. And the way we structure our ideas can be based upon how they connect in one of two ways. They could be causal or conceptual relationships. And many of the problems arise due to causal changes, and we'll focus in on that. Something happened, and that's a causal change. It caused something, and we'll focus in on that. So the steps in discovering causal relationships include laying out the account, what happened, determining the hierarchy of things, and interpreting the convergences and divergences. And convergences are the ideas and things that reinforce, supplement, or complement the events, and divergences are points that do not reinforce the events. So to see the big picture, we lay out what happened, we look at the hierarchy, and we interpreted where things converge to reinforce, supplement, or complement the events, or things took a different path and went away from and did not reinforce the events which occurred. Objectivity. Objectivity is defined as intentness on objects external to the mind. Intentness, being intent on the objects external to the mind. Subjectivity is we're just operating on our own brain. We're very subjective, using our own mind, our own brain. Objectivity is being aware, intent to be aware of the objects external to our mind. And in critical thinking, we want to have a keen sense of objectivity. This is a heuristic rule or strategy for problem solving. It's something heuristic benefiting ourselves that we need within ourselves for problem solving to be more objective. And objectivity helps us to engage more thoughtfully and deliberately in the critical thinking process overall. But we should not completely exclude our emotion or subjective feelings. It's not emotions and subjectivity are good in decision making or in problem solving, but we have to be careful. We need to be objective. And the most important thing to remember is that evaluating information objectively helps us to be more deliberate or thorough. Now, I just said emotions aren't necessarily a bad thing, and they're actually an essential thing, and they play a crucial role in the thinking process. For instance, professionals need empathy when working with others, regardless of their occupation, in order to vicariously experience what others feel, believe, or wish. We need to experience what others are feeling or wish through that person. And in order to do that, we need to have emotions. We don't want to be emotionless robots. So emotions are a good thing. But the problem with emotions is that it could cloud our decision making or our judgment. We don't want our emotions to get in the way. We can use our emotions as a beneficial tool to our benefit, but not use emotions to our detriment or let emotions take control or get a handle on us. Some are good at that. Some have areas to improve upon, and that's something that, for me, knowing strengths and weaknesses, emotions are something. I'm a passionate person. I get involved in things, but I have to be careful about my emotions so that they don't get in the way of my judgment or my thinking. So that it leads us to the next thing, being self-aware. At least I'm aware of the fact that my emotions can cloud my judgment or get in the way, and that's a good thing. I'm aware of that. It's something I could work on. I'm aware that critical thinking is something to work on, and so we should all be aware of ourselves and the feelings and opinions and the assumptions of others. This characteristic relates acutely to being aware of our feelings, opinions, and assumptions, but moreover, it's a starting point for thinking critically. Our assumptions are how the first impressions and strongest emotions are filtered when we evaluate information. So our assumptions, again, are how our first impressions and strongest emotions are filtered when we evaluate information. So be careful of our assumptions there. Now we evaluate the information. A big challenge in the process of critical thinking is how to evaluate all of this stuff. And we've looked at many different ways, steps in evaluating the information with the process of logic, but now let's delve a little deeper into the evaluation. And the best critical thinkers are people who, as Winston Churchill noted, are capable of gleaning through information that may be unclear or conflicting. He said that the true genius resides in the capacity for evaluation of uncertain, hazardous, and conflicting information. Winston Churchill. Making assumptions. We just talked about that. Assumptions, self-awareness is a starting point from which we begin to think critically. We base our decisions on assumptions and we make about objects or things. And assumptions are the arguments. But the distinguishing feature of an assumption is that it's a statement which has no proof or evidence. Assumptions are the arguments, but the distinguishing feature of an assumption is that it is a statement in which there is no proof or evidence provided. So we have assumptions, but let's put them in their box and realize that there's no proof or evidence for that assumption. It's just an assumption that we have. They can either be verbally stated, we can blurt out what our assumptions are, or we can not state them at all. They're unstated. We hold them mentally inside of ourselves. So we have these assumptions inside of us. There's no evidence. We're holding these things to be true within ourselves, and they're unstated. And then we have to watch out for the bias. As we learned earlier on logic, confirmation bias can influence the inferences we draw. And bias is not something that we can completely eliminate. We all have bias. We'll always have bias. As a matter of fact, with machine learning, we're developing computer algorithms that learn from data sets. Unfortunately, the data sets were compiled and created by humans that have bias, and now our machine learning algorithms could have bias in them. So we have infected the machine learning algorithms with our own bias based upon the data that we collected. It's hard to get rid of. We're aware of this. We're self-aware of the bias problem associated with machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms, but we need to be very much aware of it and figure out how to eliminate it. So not only is it difficult to eliminate bias within ourselves, it's difficult to eliminate the effects of the bias that we have projected on other things like data that's ultimately used in machine learning. So it's not something we can completely eliminate. However, when thinking critically, we need to watch out for confirmation bias. Remember that the confirmation bias is related to the truth. Belief bias is related to valid or validity. Confirmation bias to truth, meaning that I'm only going to seek out those statements which are true to support my premise. So we should ensure that we don't allow our preconceived opinions to influence the way we evaluate the data to the degree that we use the data to confirm what we already believe. So let's not have our preconceived notions to allow it to influence us, how we take a look at the data to confirm what we already believe. We should go into it without any beliefs, although that's hard, maybe impossible to do, and then look at the data objectively so that we can come to a pure, clean outcome of the assessment, the evaluation of the data. That's a great goal, a stretch goal, but we just have to be aware of the biases that we could bring to the table, and we should use objectivity. Objectivity is the antidote for bias. Asking questions is really important. Asking the right questions is really important. We discussed earlier how it is that asking the right questions is important, and it's also important to ask clarifying questions when making decisions. And a clarifying question is thought-provoking, and it helps the thinker acquire more information. And they could be thought-provoking, they could be generic, or they could be specific. And with clarifying questions, we can expect that other questions will arise out of the answers. So be prepared for this. Now, as an auditor, it's really interesting that if I say you did something wrong, then it's going to raise a defense mechanism, and I'll get resistance for that. And so a good way of handling a situation is to ask clarifying questions such as, do you think that is the best way to go about performing this task or this duty? And ask a clarifying question of the person, and they'll begin to explain. What's interesting is when you're asking clarifying questions, sometimes the person providing the answer will start to get clarification themselves. But you also can benefit by hearing the clarification of the question, which may raise more questions on the other person's part, or raise more questions on your part as well. So be prepared that if you ask a clarifying question, you may end up with more questions. A good tool that you can use is the SWOT analysis. You've heard me throughout this talk about strengths and my weaknesses primarily. I didn't want to dwell on strengths. Maybe that wouldn't be too humble to just capitalize on strengths, but I have strengths and weaknesses, and those are internal to me. And the SWOT analysis is to identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's a grid where the upper left-hand side is strengths, a grid of 4 squares, and upper left is strengths, upper right is weaknesses, lower left opportunities, lower right is threats. So the topmost is the strength and weaknesses, to list them out. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And these are things internal to me. And then at the bottom half of it, it's from left to right, opportunities and threats. So what are the opportunities and what are the threats? And these things are the external factors. So when we're evaluating, looking at things, trying to solve a problem, we could look at the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats. You've probably already used this, so I won't dig deeper into it, but a SWOT analysis can be a good tool that we could use for critical thinking. So what are the benefits of critical thinking? Well, we know it's important. We've gone through it, but in particular, it helps us to make better decisions and rationally apply information. But there are much more that we can gain from critical thinking. We could be more persuasive, a better communicator, better at problem solving, and increase our emotional intelligence. Being more persuasive. Yeah, you think a car salesman is persuasive or whatever, but persuasiveness is something that is important to everybody. Persuasiveness is a characteristic of being able to influence others. And anytime we want to have others accept our ideas, we do this through the power of persuasion. And critical thinking can help us become more persuasive, because critical thinking is deliberate. It's a thoughtful process. And the more deliberate we are, the better we are at expressing our assumptions, our ideas, and persuading others. And it's a great skill to have, because persuasion can inspire, motivate, energize people, and help us accomplish our goals by being persuasive, by the influencing of others properly. And communication is another way to another characteristic of a critical thinking, and critical thinking improves communication for the same reason that it also improves persuasiveness. And many of the same factors we use to improve our persuasiveness, they go hand in hand. The persuasion and the communication go hand in hand. They play off each other positively, hopefully for a positive reason. So, for example, we could use analogies or metaphors. They're great persuasion and communication techniques. And in addition to that, it's helping us using language more persuasively. Critical thinking also helps us to use language with more clarity. And I give presentations a lot. I'm doing podcasting. I'm not using any analogies right now. I don't think I've used analogies or metaphors in this podcast, but I use them all the time because they're very helpful, especially in dealing with maybe boring regulatory things, to make them interesting to folks. Like, for example, where did the ALCOA acronym come from for data integrity? That's fascinating, and that's not an analogy or a metaphor, but it's helping to tell a story that brings things and engages people. But an analogy or a metaphor is really good to get points across. We talked about change earlier, so a good metaphor for change is a caterpillar, right? It turns into a butterfly. So that's an example of how we can use that. And there's a book, How to Argue and Win Every Time. And I kind of felt guilty reading it because people would see me reading that if I was flying on a plane, but it's a great book because he tells a story. This is the individual that defended at the time Imelda Marcos when she had the issue with all of the shoes, and he was able to convince the jury by explaining that the shoes are gifts. People admired her, and they gave her gifts of shoes, and she didn't want to offend the people, so she kept all of those shoes, and that's the reason why she had so many shoes. So that's a defense lawyer, but as a defense lawyer, he was very well known, and he used the analogies and metaphors quite effectively to win cases, very prominent cases. Better problem solving. So critical thinking and problem solving are closely related. This is yet another characteristic of a critical thinker. They're almost intertwined. And sometimes we say that to solve logic problems, we must use our critical thinking skills. In fact, logic, critical thinking, and problem solving use the same cognitive processes. And critical thinkers use their problem solving skills and not just intuition to make decisions or draw conclusions. Again, critical thinkers, we want to use our problem-solving skills and not just operate on intuition all alone. Gut feeling is good. We should listen to it, but that's not the only tool that we should have in our arsenal. We should also use our problem-solving skills as well. Another characteristic, emotional intelligence. We want to increase our emotional intelligence. And so what is it, and how does critical thinking help to increase our emotional intelligence? Well, emotional intelligence is identified as the ability to assess and control the emotions of ourselves, oneself, and others and groups. So emotional intelligence, the ability to assess and control our emotions, the emotions of others, and even in groups. It's being heart smart, not book smart. So emotional intelligence is operating from the heart, not the mind. Heart smart, not book smart. And critical thinking helps increase emotional intelligence because one of the characteristics of a critical thinker is self-awareness. We talked about that earlier. And critical thinkers know how and when to use emotions, such as empathy, in making decisions. The right emotion at the right time and the proper amount. The more a person uses his or her critical thinking skills, the better adept they become in identifying, understanding, and managing their emotions. So it may be hard to identify your emotions at first. You see the charts, you go in, how are you feeling today? You pick whatever phase you may be feeling, happy, sad, whatever. There's a whole bunch of different emotions, a lot more than I thought. I mean, I was surprised when I saw the chart. I'm like, wow, I didn't realize there were so many emotions, but it helps to identify these emotions to figure out where we're at, how they're interconnected. And the more that we use our critical thinking skills, the better we become at identifying, understanding, and managing our emotions and using them properly. So emotional intelligence in general consists of 4 abilities: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. Changing our perspective. So the interesting thing about perspective is everybody has one. We all have perspectives. We all have opinions. And earlier we learned how important it is to have an open mind, how important open-mindedness is in critical thinking. And one aspect of this is that it makes us receptive to others' viewpoints. We don't want to limit our viewpoint. If we have a closed mind and add that to bias, we're going to have a limited viewpoint. Closed mind plus bias equals limited viewpoint, and we don't want that. It's important for us to not be limited in our viewpoint. The less open-minded and more biased we are, the more limited we are. And so the challenge in critical thinking is to avoid these limitations of our point of view and not be constrained by cognitive or mental binders, barriers. And it's important to consider the other person's viewpoint. Everybody wants to be heard and considered. And one reason we find it so difficult to consider another person's viewpoint or another group's viewpoint is that we are over-concerned with our own opinions and views. So we should consider others and not be over-concerned with our own. A challenge for a critical thinker is to step down from the mountain of self and climb up to the mountain of the other individual. And considering others' viewpoints is easier when we understand the benefits of doing so. For example, it helps us be more empathetic, it helps us to see a bigger picture, and it also promotes objectivity, and we want to be more objective and not so subjective. So in this podcast, we've discussed bias and how it influences our conclusions and the logic process. But what are some of the influences on bias? The first thing that can influence bias is the way the person interprets information they are receiving. The other influence on bias is the way the presenter or speaker frames questions or information. For instance, researchers have found that hypothetical questions influence behavior and promote bias. And the key to not being influenced by hypothetical information is to remember that it's just that and not factual information. So if we ask a hypothetical question, we're going to get biased feedback. So the influences on bias are interpreting information, how the information is framed, and how factual the information actually is that can influence the bias. What do we do when new information arises? Well, we can follow this approach. When we as a critical thinker receive new information, we can start to organize a schema. Like I said earlier, a database modeler, designer, database architect develops a schema to show the interrelationships of data, like a relational database management system. That's why it's called a relational database management system, how things relate to each other. So when new information arrives, organize it into a schema and see the relationships, the categories, what box it falls into, and then it will show us the role. And we should identify the role that the new information plays and compartmentalize that information into familiar formats. And from that, we could stand back and objectively see how we can use that information visually by illustrating the buckets or the compartments that it fits in and how it relates, and help us make good decisions, critically thinking through the process. A major benefit of the critical thinking is that it gives us the ability to solve problems, and it doesn't matter whatever our profession is, industry we work in life, we're presented daily with a host of decisions and problems. So critical thinking helps us solve problems at work, at home, everywhere in our life. Some psychologists actually define a problem as a gap or barrier between where an individual is and where they wish to be. So in other words, a problem is the space between point A and point B. So problems are essentially, they consist of the initial state and the goal state. All possible solution paths leading to the goal state are located in the problem space. And researchers say that problem solving has three primary stages: preparation or familiarization, production, judgment, and evaluation. Much of the critical thinking is about how we connect the 2 points in a problem, A versus B. However, sometimes critical thinkers are presented with inconsistencies, or what scientists, what we call cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance appears through a discrepancy between attitudes and beliefs. It appears other places as well, like paintings. If the sun is at one location and the shadow is cast differently, then we have cognitive dissonance because our mind is telling us something isn't right. This shadow isn't cast, and it's disturbing to us if we look at that painting or that image and it's not correct. And cognitive dissonance can appear through discrepancies between attitudes and beliefs. It doesn't have to be physical. And inconsistencies can be called variances or dissimilarities. It's a natural tendencies to want to eliminate inconsistencies when solving a problem. The best way critical thinkers can identify these inconsistencies is by using their logic and objectivity to see these variances. Let's find out what these areas of cognitive dissonance and eliminate them because they're disturbing to us and they're not helping us solve this, but it's good to identify them so they're not obscuring the right decision or being a distraction from the what's true and valid. Identifying inconsistencies would fall under the first stage of problem solving, in which we're familiarizing ourselves with it. Again, familiarization and problem solving is the first stage, and And we want to identify the inconsistencies right from the beginning. We want to trust our instincts. They fall under the second stage of problem solving, which the second stage is the discrepancies. So we want to identify our, the second is the production. So we want to identify our instincts and see how start to see the solution pass forwards. Instincts are defined, they're natural, they're intuitive power. Our intuition or instincts are key pieces in problem solving. It's not the only tool we have. We don't want only to operate on our instincts, but we can use them as a tool. And when we couple this with trial and error, informed guesses and brainstorming, intuition and instincts can lead to a highly creative process. So we use our intuition and instincts, and we couple that with trial and error and informed guesses and brainstorming. Asking why is a good tool. There is even a practice, a Japanese Toyota practice, I believe, is the 5 whys. Ask why 5 times and you could get to the root cause. Some say that if you ask it 4 times, you'll get to the root cause. But you keep asking why. Why is an important problem-solving technique. It's not sufficient to be simply presented with the information or data. Ask why. Like a child, why? Why is the sky blue? Well, that's the color. Why? Well, I mean, it starts getting irritating. They keep asking why because we find out we don't have the answers after a few whys, and it forces us to really get to the root cause or the true answer. Critical thinkers should be willing to dig deeper and explore various possibilities, be open-minded to different things, learn new things, expand our thinking. And asking why can fall under the 3 stages of problem solving that we mentioned earlier. Then we evaluate the solution. Once a possible solution has been derived, problem solvers feel that they can proceed with the solution. However, you don't want to overlook the all-important step of evaluating all the possible solutions. So don't think, oh, we got a solution, let's go ahead and go with it. We need to evaluate the different solutions. And sometimes the problem has more than one solution, and we should take the time to evaluate the efficacy of each alternative as it relates to critical thinking skills. Evaluation, also called judgment, and it's the 3rd stage of the problem solving that we outlined above. The critical thinker should evaluate each alternative and judge which one is the best. And the following are the steps that an effective evaluation technique can take on. So the steps are: identify the pros and cons of each possible solution, develop a criteria or requirements and assign weights to each criteria, prioritize the criteria, rate the proposed solutions using the criteria. So these are effective evaluation techniques, looking at pros and cons, what's the requirements, what's the weight for them, prioritizing them, rating the proposed solutions using the criteria, and figure out what you believe the group believes is the best question. And then always ask questions. The importance of inquisitiveness cannot be overemphasized in the process of critical thinking. One contribution to civilization that Socrates made was that he advocated questioning as important during debate. So questioning is extremely important. Some of us don't like to be questioned, but it's actually really important to get true facts. From that, we could get validity and come to the correct solution. And learning is the process sparked by the desire to know more. We want to be inquisitive and curiosity. We want to have these things as the foundation of learning. And these questions that are constantly asked lead us to possible solution paths and ultimately to answers. And critical thinkers never abandon the questioning process. It's always good to ask questions, find out why, learn new things, expand our horizons. So the best way to improve our critical thinking skills is to practice them, and we should develop ways to remember, organize this, our techniques, develop our own plan, our own schema on how we're going to accomplish this, the way we organize information, how we think, and try to improve upon our critical thinking and creative thinking on a daily basis, hourly basis, weekly basis, and improve upon that. Why did we go through all of that? Well, we started off with computer software assurance, CSA. CSA encourages critical thinking at the top. So when we approach a problem and we're going to do validation, risk-based validation, a least burdensome approach, we need to comply with regulatory requirements, our company's quality system, our SOPs and procedures. So we have to apply critical thinking. Ask questions. We need to be objective. We need to be empathetic, open-minded towards others. We need to gather the information, look at all of the facts, and then apply logic to those. Find out what we can gain from that information, but always be careful about what is true and valid to make sure that if we're considering it as valid, we don't have any belief bias there. Or if it is what we're considering to be true, we don't have any confirmation bias. We have to ask the right questions, organize our information, and then draw our conclusions based upon inferences that we can get, but make sure that we only infer what is being the data implies, the data we collected, and check to ensure our inferences are consistent and no underlying assumptions, or identify our underlying assumptions so we could see what they are. Don't be active listening. If somebody's explaining something to you, listen to what they say. Don't be formulating how you're going to argue with them, but listen, be empathetic. You'll connect with people. And when you're going through, you want to be persuasive and develop those techniques. Be an effective communicator using metaphors and analogies, and persuasion and communication are going hand in hand. And these are just some of the things that we went through. I know it's a lot of information to be thrown at you, but critical thinking is an important skill set, especially nowadays, not just because of CSA, computer software assurance, but technology is moving so fast. It's impossible to know everything. We have to apply critical thinking to make decisions based upon what we have before us, and rely not just upon intuition, but rely upon facts and data, the truth of the matter. Find out what's valid to make those decisions. So critical thinking is an important skill in our current career. It's a skill that is now being taught in schools, like in Australia, at the grade school level, and employers are recognizing this. But in our industry in life sciences, critical thinking is percolated up to the top, primarily recently because of computer software assurance. So tune in next week. We'll dive into the next aspect, which is assurance needs as it relates to computer software assurance, CSA. And the reason why we're doing this is because the engagement with the previous episode was a lot. We've had more downloads than any other episode, and so I felt diving a little bit deeper into each aspect is important, and critical thinking's at the top, so we started off with critical thinking. And if you want to go to the prior episode then you'll actually get the highlight of what computer software assurance is and what actually prompted this podcast. Don't worry, we're still going to talk to the expert on blockchain and how it will impact us. I just wanted to respond to the audience's reaction, the listeners, your reaction to CSA and interest in CSA. So hopefully this is helpful for you as well. Enjoy, and tune in next week when we bring the next show to you.